Hello, thank you for the invitation to participate in this conference. The title of my presentation is Picasso's Stay in Gosol, A Window to the Abyss. Following the completion of Les Familles de Saltimbanque, in which he worked from the end of 1904 to the autumn of 1905, Pablo Picasso had planned another ambitious multi-figure figure depicting a group of nude adolescents watering their horses in an abstract landscape. Sketches for the project suggest, again, a thoughtful painting on a large scale. In both the 1905 work and the follow-up of 1906, we're dealing with individuals placed in a liminal environment, thus projecting the artist's own image. According to critics, these canvases echo the notion of counterspaces, those other spaces reserved for individuals whose behavior is deviant when compared with the average or the norm. Society pushes those counterspaces to its margins, to the empty spaces that surround it. 1906 was a transitional year for Picasso, a year dividing youth from maturity, promise from fulfillment, and during the following months of intense work, a painter of late 19th century sensibility would be reborn as a prophet of modernity. Taking crucial steps on the path to an artistic revolution, he had no clear destination in mind, except the intention to push his art in a new direction, to challenge the leading artist, Henri Matisse, and his 5 colleagues. In seeking an alternative to the Frenchman's chromatic extravagance, he resorted to the art of the past. His search led him not just to Pierre Puvis de Chavannes and Paul Gauguin, but even further back to Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. The place Picasso gave for his first encounter with Henri Matisse was the Salon des Indépendants, running from March 20th to April 30th, 1906, in Paris. The centerpiece of the exhibition was the latter's monumental Le Bonheur de Vivre, which the collector Leo Stein would later buy. Critics were horrified by the flatness, bright colors, eclectic style, and mixed technique of this innovative painting. There was a sense among all groundbreaking artists, not just Picasso and Matisse, that Western traditions were spent, and that each in his own way was attempting to revitalize or should revitalize artistic practice by tapping into something more primeval, more authentic. Now that he had been able to assess his adversary face to face, the competitive Pablo Picasso went into his work, as it were, full steam. He could no longer allow the senior artist's supremacy to go unchallenged. In the face of his rival's ubiquity, he preferred to remain aloof, biding his time until he felt he had the upper hand. Critics have seen the interaction between the two painters as a dialogue, using Mikhail Bakhtin's term, where understanding is to utterance as one line of dialogue is to the next, striving to match the speaker's word with a counterword from the listener. At first, Picasso and Matisse met regularly and subjected each other's work to intense scrutiny. Picasso would later say, "You've got to be able to picture side by side everything Matisse and I were doing at the time. No one has ever looked at Matisse's painting more carefully than I, and no one has looked at mine more carefully than he." He realized that the older painter was developing into one of the most inventive innovators in history, one who knew how to evoke not just light, but space, form and atmosphere through color, and how to establish a whole new abstract range of harmonies. Picasso shut himself up in his studio for hours and hours on end, in response to his need to attend to the challenge. As Palau remarked, it was not simply a matter of aesthetic concentration, but rather an absorption of Faust-like proportions. Those images he put down acted on him as fertilizing agents that led to the emergence of invigorated beings. Although these may have come about through a confrontation between his art and Matisse's, those new visions were clearly in the spirit of both Paul Gauguin and Pierre Puvis de Chavannes, as we've already said, whose work had also been featured at the recent Interdisciplinary. By the time Picasso was ready to paint a definitive version of his painting on an Arcadian theme, he must have realized that the Puvis-inspired writers would hardly have qualified him for victory in the avant-garde when compared with Matisse's more radical approach, so the project was abandoned. What he did was develop a number of takes from that composition, showing one single youth accompanied by a horse in Les Meneurs de Chevalnieu. This transformation was analogous to a progressive formal abstraction in the execution of his characters, an indication of Picasso's contemporary search for greater sobriety and classicism, in contrast with Matisse's canvases. Around midwinter, Picasso visited the Louvre exhibition of Iberian sculptures, dating largely to the 4th century BC, that had been excavated a few years earlier at Osuna and Cerro de los Santos, revealing to him a primitive art indigenous to his own country that he had been unaware of. To the non-archaeological eye, these objects might have seemed of little aesthetic value. They tended to be small and crude in execution, but to him, they were a major revelation. This is where he could find the appropriate response to Matisse, he thought. In addition to their atavistic aura, their roughness and primitiveness commended them to someone who was looking for ways to demolish tradition canons in a different way. An example of Iberian sculptures you can see on the left-hand side. Around this time, the dealer Ambroise Vollard visited his studio and purchased 27 of his most important canvases for a total of 2,000 francs. This was a staggering price for the still little-known 25-year-old Picasso. Added to the sum received from other buyers, for example, Leo Stein, that we mentioned earlier, he had enough funds now to spend some time off in Spain, as he had hoped. When the collector, Leo Stein, found out, he wrote a note to Matisse, informing him of the remarkable purchase. Picasso has done a major sale with Vollard, he wrote. He has sold enough paintings to him to cover his expenses for a while. The style of this communication suggests that Matisse knew his opponent sufficiently well to take a particular interest in his financial situation, which had been otherwise extremely difficult at the time. Picasso and his companion, Fernando Olivier, now traveled to the remote village of Gosol, located 160 kilometers north of Barcelona, close to the French border, at a height of 1,500 meters. Gosol was in fact two villages. The original medieval one, built around a castle high on a hill, had been deserted for centuries. The other one, nestled in a valley below, was sheltered by 4 separate mountain ranges. For all the bleakness of its surroundings, Gosol at the time looked like a primeval green oasis in a landscape spotted with pristine patches of green and ochre. Even though the picture on the left-hand side is a recent picture of Gosol, but you can see that not much has changed. It's still pretty much a pretty desolate place, and it still looks pretty pristine, as I mentioned in my readout. Picasso went to Gosol with all the materials he would need to paint at his heart's content. He wanted to bring about a big transformation in his work, not only out of personal need to break through as an artist, but also because he was convinced that the type was ripe to carry it out. The magnificent scenery, contrasting as much as possible with the seedy streets of Montmartre or Barcelona, where he had come from, and that he had been exposed to for a while, was ideal to help him find a new reality, a new palette, and a new aesthetic. The thematic focus of the paintings created at the beginning of his stay in Gosol focused on youthful male nudes, who, while echoing the works painted in Paris and Barcelona, took Picasso's figure language rooted in classicism to new heights. If these major paintings look back at Arcadian compositions, like the ones he had already done, the emphasis now was on their Hellenistic origin. The pose of some of these characters can be traced to the classical Greek kouros, already found in Les Meneurs de Chevalnieu. Static, monumental sculptures of athletic young men associated with the cult of Apollo. But the Gosol stay prompted many kinds of regression further back to ancient roots. In the background was still the impression those 5th and 6th century BC primitive Iberian sculptures had made on him. Picasso would work enthusiastically, as the huge number of works demonstrates. He was very, very prolific during his stay in Gosol. His subjects were now deeply influenced by what he had seen at the Louvre's Iberian exhibition. And as Richardson wrote, if for the time being Picasso did not see how to harness their primitivism to his work, the months he was to spend in Spain in the summer would show him just how to do so. Fernando Olivier's easygoing nature kept her in good stead at Gosol, as we read in her own diary. She did not mind the austerity and did not miss the Parisian cafes, shops, and friends. She could not resist telling her friends in her writing what rapture life was up there in air of incredible purity above the clouds, surrounded by people who were amiable, hospitable, and without guile. She wrote, "We have found out what happiness can be like. No cloud shed discord on Picasso and me, because having no cause for jealousy, all his worries had disappeared. Never again would the two of them be as happy as they were in this Garden of Eden." In Les Harems that Picasso painted in Gosol, he made a recapitulation of many of the other studies of Fernando Olivier. The painting, in fact, includes 4 naked Fernandes in that intimate setting. She's combing her hair, washing, looking at herself in a mirror, lying down. You can see all these figures represent Fernand. The presence of a clothed procuress crouching in the corner had even managed to transform the harem into a bordello. Given the artist's versatility at projecting himself into his own fictional characters, it is tempting to read the male giant who contemplates the scene while he grabs his porron, the glass container containing wine, as a self-portrait. The sensuality of the painting is not just limited to its subject matter. The artist treated the surface of the canvas with the tenderness of a potter kneading clay, using a palette of warm ochres and terracottas as he worked on it. Incidentally, this is a major painting that will have an impact on the last painting that we'll be talking about in this presentation, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, also on a bordello theme. Gosol also prompted Picasso to branch out in a new direction, addressing himself seriously to the genre of still life. In Nature Morte ou Vase, each item exists within its own spatial zone, while being subordinate both to the strict overall rhythm and to the logic of confrontation and interaction in the composition. The objects are insubstantial, but they're painted with the sensuousness and loaded symbolism that anticipates the sensuality of later work. Everything is as terracotta or flesh color as in a figure painting. And the ubiquitous male porron introduces once again sexual innuendos, the same porron that we've seen in the previous painting. Indeed, the picture is divided into a male half, the 2 vertical glass vessels on the left, and a female half, the 2 rounded pots on the right, one of which has a breast-like lid. So we can see that even these still lifes are kind of bordello scenes, just like what we saw earlier. Another erotically charged still life is Nature Morte au Tableau. The warm brown teapot sits between a small jade green cup and a violet gray bottle. At the far right, there's a blue bowl ornamented in a warm, glittering gold, and it stands next to a white and light gray porron again. The latter is partially hidden behind a white feminine teapot facing the opposite way. They all seem to be confronting each other. Their existence depends on that very opposition. So again, this is even though it is a still life, it looks like it is the interaction of figures in a landscape, let's say. Set off against the beige background, a white drawing sheet and a small painting with a gold frame appears to represent a woman, probably Fernando Olivier, with a rose in her hair. The porron again makes its sexual pun as it points towards the female portrait. So you can see here again, confrontation between female and male. Written across the bottom of the framed picture is the inscription, Les Preguntes, suggesting a dialogue again, just like the dialogue that we see throughout this period. The influence of Paul Gauguin is clear. He often included such open questions about existence in his Tahitian pictures. Back in Paris, Picasso still had in mind those Iberian sculptures he had seen in the Louvre. In the process of completing the portrait of Gertrude Stein, the sister of Leo Stein, it became notably more primitive. The emphasis is on the dissembling power of the mask. The real eyes lie behind it, unreadable, a property of the true self, as opposed to the false disguise that both shields and conceals. So we can see in this portrait the important influence of Iberian sculptures. So the influence was not just on figure representation applied to Fernando Olivier, but also on a portrait of other people like Gertrude Stein that he had started before his trip to Gosol, and he completed after the trip. As Worth has argued, the masking of the face introduces a complex, unstable image of the body that holds in tension, often to the point of incoherence, different degrees of stylization and embodiment, as well as conflict. Thus, the mask fosters layered, mobile, unstable identities and articulates oppositions between inner and outer, true and false, self and other, presence and absence, order and disorder, protection and threat. So the mask is a crucial liminal element, which is the main theme of this presentation. It was a godlike energy that Picasso had brought back with him from Gosol, an energy soon to be compacted into the titanic self-portrait that presented him, as we see here on the left-hand side, palette in hand, bursting with imminent power, on the verge of revitalizing a world still haunted by the historical ghosts he had conjured up during his sojourn on Spanish soil. His triumphant group of self-portraits from the mid-autumn bear witness to a shamanistic exaltation. At this time, these portraits can be read as an artist's manifesto. They propose an alternative to Matisse's leadership in the avant-garde. So Picasso is presenting himself as the new leader. The Frenchman wanted to soothe, comfort, and delight. The Spaniard wanted to challenge, excite, and shock. Picasso now began to work alone in his studio, uninterrupted for many hours at a time. Interestingly, it was apparently through his opponent, Henri Matisse, that Picasso first came in contact with African sculpture. The old artist had a growing interest in it, shared also by Flamand and Derain. He had purchased the first piece, a Billy statuette from the Congo, at a shop in Paris belonging to the dealer nicknamed Le Père Sauvage. What intrigued Picasso about these masks and statues was the piercing insight that art was fundamentally not an aesthetic practice at all, but a system for manipulating the hidden forces of the universe. Meyer Shapiro writes that primitive arts at this time acquired the special prestige of the timeless and the instinctive on the level of the spontaneous animal activity, self-contained, unreflective, private, without dates or signatures, without origins or consequences, except in the emotions. He grasped that African art was the vehicle for the mimicry not of things or creatures, but of a collective emotion. With Apollinaire, Jacob, and Salmon, Picasso was in the habit of meeting Matisse for dinner on most Thursday evenings. Jacob would later report that it was at the French painter's place that the Spaniard saw his first Negro sculpture, or at least was struck by it for the first time. He wrote, "We were dining one Thursday evening at Matisse's on the Quai de Saint-Michel, and Salmon, Apollinaire, Picasso, and myself. Matisse took a black wooden statuette from a table and showed it to Picasso. It was the first piece of Negro wooden art. Picasso held onto it all evening. The next morning, when I arrived at the studio, the floor was strewn with sheets of paper, and on each sheet was drawn the head of a woman. All of them were more or less the same: one eye, an oversized nose attached to the mouth, and a lock of hair on the shoulders. Cubism was thus born." So we can see here, he sees a clear correlation between the African sculptures and some of the innovations that Picasso is going to introduce with Cubism. His staying also had prepared Picasso precisely for this exploration into a primitive sphere. Knowing of his friend's interest in primitive art, André Derain urged Picasso to visit the ethnographic museum known as the Trocadero in Paris, and the experience for Picasso was exhilarating. Picasso would later comment, "I realized it was very important. Something was happening to me, right? The masks were not sculptures like the others, not at all. They were magical things. The Negroes were intercessors against everything, against unknown, threatening spirits. All those fetishes were used for the same thing. They were weapons. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon had to happen that very day. It was my first exorcism canvas." Henceforth, his female models are transformed into solid sculpture forms with bodies built out of geometric facets. deviating from the standard classical ideal of beauty, creating instead figures with larger heads, heavy shoulders, and narrow hips. As his way of modeling changed, the surface of the paint became increasingly tactile and raw. The elegance of contour was sidestepped in deference to solid mass. He was out to prove that painting was capable of matching the intense physical impact of volumetric works, developing a kind of hybrid sculpture painting as a radical option for the new century that serves to push the limits. The model for these pictures was still Fernande Olivier, although her body had now undergone a radical metamorphosis in its primitivist and quasi-geometrical deformations. Picasso repeated indefinitely the same stocky form, eyes filled with dark shadows and gazing nowhere, thereby warding off any psychological or emotional pitfalls. Richardson perfectly surmises this momentous period. He wrote, Picasso had finally seen how primitivism could enable him to fuse the conflicts inherent in his style and vision. He realized that he had the confidence, imagination, and power to execute a masterpiece that would, in the words of Apollinaire, free art from its shackles and extend its frontiers. A painting that would provide artists of the new century a license to take every conceivable liberty, break every conceivable rule, and demolish even the ruins. Picasso heard the call of the shaman, a call to a type of visionary knowledge, a call that breaks from the so-called normal circumstances. African myths spoke of the fall of man once he had separated himself from the realm and of a desire return to that lost paradise in a liminal space. What Picasso was struggling to find now was an artistic language worthy of that metamorphosing energy that would now make a Gosol a permanent state of mind. Thank you.